An important part of risk management is the implementation of proper risk treatment, or sometimes called risk response. The idea of risk treatment is once we have identified the risk through a risk assessment process, we will then implement a control in order to reduce that risk to an acceptable level. It is important as auditors that we review the effectiveness and efficiency of the information systems controls that have been put in place within the organization. Information systems controls themselves are there to provide reasonable assurance, therefore, that the business goals and objectives will be achieved. It's important to remember this. The purpose still of the systems, information systems, is to support business needs and business goals. Therefore, there's always a delicate and a difficult balance of finding what is an appropriate level of control, but still not such that it would impede the ability of the business to meet its objectives. We also have to ensure that we have put in adequate or appropriate controls to ensure that undesired events will be prevented or detected, and, of course, corrected should an event happen. Controls, therefore, are built to operate at different levels within the organization and to, of course, address different ways of mitigating risk. We can say that when we put in place an appropriate level of control, we create a risk culture. We ensure that everyone is aware of the appropriateness and the reason for those controls, and that they realize that adherence and compliance with the controls is a part of their responsibility. In the end, enforcement of controls is not really the responsibility of the security department or of the auditor. The enforcement of the controls is a responsibility of each individual to adhere to the controls, and the managers then to ensure that all of the people within their staff are then complying with those controls. We need to have effective controls. One of the things an auditor must always watch for are situations where we have controls which are ineffective or inadequate. We can say that the control itself was not able to correctly mitigate the risk. Maybe the control missed the target, shall we say. And as an auditor, we'll check first of all for compliance with the policies and procedures and controls, but also to ensure that we have put in the right controls in order to mitigate risk effectively. We can say that there are a number of different types of controls we put in place. Manual controls as well as automated. We can put in tools that will help us to ensure that controls and risk has been mitigated through some type of automated process, which might check, for example, balancing, it might check for login sequences, but also we'll do a manual review, checking for errors, correct job completions that could in some cases indicate whether or not the control was effective. The best controls are ones that prevent something from happening. A preventative control is one that will then operate before the adverse event has taken place. And examples of preventative controls could be a deterrent that tries to discourage somebody from doing something wrong. They could also be then some type of directive control that tells people what is or is not acceptable, such as an acceptable use policy for an organization. Another type of preventative control is one that tries to stop an event, such as we could say we put up a fence to stop someone from trespassing across the property. We then will put in place detective controls. Detective controls are ones that notice when somebody has done something wrong. At this point, the preventative controls were ineffective, or people were able to find a way to bypass the preventative controls, and it's important for us to be able to notice that there has been some type of a breach. We need alarming, we need some type of detective control that will bring to our attention the fact that a policy or procedure has been breached. Once we have noticed that there has been a breach, we need to contain that incident, stop it from spreading. Let's say, for example, with fire. We put in preventative controls that say no smoking in this area, where we might have gasoline vapors or something similar. We try to prevent having a fire. However, we also have a smoke detector. That is a detective control then that will detect or notice if we've had a fire in that area. Once we've detected that fire, we'll implement corrective controls, such as a fire extinguisher or fire suppression system that will then stop that fire from spreading. Try to resume our control of that situation and stop the chaos and quick expansion of that incident. A control should not be put in place just to have a control, just to create an illusion of some type of activity. There should be a clear purpose and justification for the control. The control is there because we know of a specific risk. We need to mitigate that risk, and therefore what is an adequate, appropriate, effective control we can put in place that will reduce that risk down to an acceptable level. The goal in the end is to build our systems in such a way that they will support and enable business activities. They will protect the assets of the organization and enable us to attain the objectives and purposes for which, as an organization, we are in business. The auditor should always check, therefore, when we come into performing the audit, whether or not that control has met those two goals. Has it mitigated the risk? And is this the right control to help the business to be able to reach its objectives in a stable, resilient, and reliable manner? When we audit controls, we therefore ensure we have the right controls in place and that those controls are effective to mitigate risk. They are cost effective because every control comes with a cost. The initial cost to purchase and implement the control, the cost to maintain and to enforce the control. We need to ensure we have not spent more money preventing an incident than the incident itself would have been worth were it to happen. We audit to ensure those controls are being managed. For example, if we've put in a firewall, a very common information systems control, we will check then to ensure that control is properly configured, that firewall is being properly managed, the staff has the appropriate training, and we have then both the technical and non-technical supporting elements to ensure that control is being managed and operated in an efficient and effective manner. At the end, we want to ensure that the residual risk, the risk that remains once a control is put in place, is within an acceptable boundary. The organization may declare it is willing to accept a certain level of risk. Our challenge then is to make sure that once we have implemented the controls, the level of risk is within that acceptable limit. In order to help us ensure we have appropriate controls, and to ensure that we didn't miss something, there are a number of very good control frameworks that we can rely on. For example, ISACA has COBIT 5, a whole series of different management processes that we can review to say, have we addressed all of the control areas that we should have? We also have very good documents such as the ISO IEC 27001 and 27002. These define the Information Security Management System. They are a list of well over 100 controls that are put in place to try to ensure we have a complete and thorough security program. We also have from the National Institute of Standards and Technology several special publications, such as Special Publication 800-53, which tells us which controls are necessary depending on the classification or categorization of a system. We have a number of general controls, for example, such as policies. Policies would be considered to be an administrative or managerial control. A policy is a type of directive control that will tell people what is or is not acceptable. But policies, in the end, are nothing but words. We need to take those words and the good intent of policy and make sure then that we have backed that up with the correct step-by-step actions necessary to implement then the intention of that policy. And these will be called procedures. An example of a procedure is how to set up a new user, for example. The policy says that only authorized people will be granted access. The procedure says, how will we then recognize an authorized person? We can also put in physical controls. We use the example of a fence, but we can also, of course, have locks on the doors, and physical controls can be maintaining the correct operational environment for our systems, such as temperature and humidity controls. When we talk about administrative or managerial controls, these are often called the soft controls we put in place. And they will include, as we saw, things like policies, such as warning banners we might have when a person goes to log in, and other types of controls such as disciplinary action, security awareness training that are general across the entire organization. The idea behind having general controls is that these apply to all systems rather than, as we'll look at in a moment, system-specific controls which will apply to one specific system. When it comes to finance, we put in place accounting controls, trying to ensure the correct protection of the financial assets of the organization, and operational controls, which could include procedures, which are used to ensure that our systems are being then managed and operated in an effective and, of course, secure manner. When we take a look then at system-specific controls, these are controls we tailor and design specifically for risks associated with an information system. They are there to protect sensitive data, critical functions, anything that could pose a risk associated with this individual system. Obviously, where possible, we want to use general controls. But we then have to quite often bring in controls which are more system specific to help us then to protect that individual system, which may be something which is critical to business operations or, for example, may contain sensitive data. We put in place controls to protect against improper access, either to the system itself or the data that it contains. This is something we're going to look at in quite a bit more detail later on, where we talk about the protection of information assets. To sum up, controls are implemented in order to address risk effectively and certainly appropriately. Controls may be preventative to try to stop something from happening, detective to notice when something does happen, corrective to enable me to contain and hopefully restore control in a chaotic situation, as well as controls may be administrative or managerial, technical or sometimes called logical controls, such as say a firewall or an access control system, and they may be operational or physical, dealing with the procedures and the operational environment for our systems.